Every time something shifts behind the scenes, every time there's uncertainty, one name somehow ends up dragged into the spotlight: Shedeur Sanders. And the strange part, it rarely has anything to do with what he actually did on the field. This time was no different. A coaching change, a routine press conference, a moment that should have passed quietly, but instead it turned into something else entirely, the kind of moment where you can almost feel a headline being baited into existence. Because the question he was asked wasn't really a question. It was framed just carefully enough to corner him. Say one thing and it sounds like he's throwing someone under the bus. Say the opposite and suddenly he's being painted as ungrateful or disloyal. Either way, controversy was waiting. And here where things changed. Instead of playing along, instead of giving the media what it wanted, Shedeur stopped. He didn't rush. He didn't snap. He didn't give them a quote they could twist. Instead, he did something most players never do. He exposed the play while it was happening. That moment caught people off guard, not because it was loud, but because it was controlled. And for fans who have been paying attention, it felt familiar. Because this wasn't about one question. It wasn't about one press conference. It was about a pattern that's been building quietly for years. And once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore what's really been going on behind the headlines. The room felt normal at first. Cameras rolling, reporters waiting. Another routine press conference where the answers are usually predictable and carefully worded. This was supposed to be just another stop in the never-ending media cycle. But then the question came and the tone shifted. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't openly hostile. That's what made it dangerous. The wording was polished, almost polite, but underneath it carried a setup. A fork in the road where every possible response led to the same destination: controversy. Praise the new situation and it sounds like disrespect toward the past. Defend the old situation and suddenly it's framed as resistance to change. There was no neutral lane. You could see the pause, not confusion, calculation. Most players answer instinctively. They rely on training. They deflect. They throw out a safe quote and move on. But this time, that didn't happen. Instead of rushing to protect optics, he stopped and addressed the intent behind the question itself. That's what caught everyone off guard. Because the moment wasn't about football anymore. It was about narrative control, about recognizing when a question isn't meant to inform, but to extract, when it's designed less for clarity and more for clickability. And in that split second, the entire dynamic flipped. Rather than being the subject of the story, he turned the spotlight back on the process. He didn't accuse. He didn't lash out. He calmly pointed out that the question wasn't neutral, that it was structured to produce a headline no matter how he answered. And once that was said out loud, the tension in the room became impossible to ignore. That kind of awareness doesn't come from one bad experience. It comes from repetition, from seeing words twisted, from watching small moments balloon into narratives that don't quite match reality. For viewers watching closely, this wasn't defiance. It was recognition. Recognition of a familiar tactic. Recognition of a setup that's played out countless times before. And recognition that staying silent in moments like this doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it just hands control to someone else. But what made this moment even more telling was how quickly it resonated. Because fans didn't see arrogance. They didn't see attitude. They saw someone refusing to be boxed into a false choice. And once that happened, it opened a much bigger question. If this exchange felt calculated, how many times had similar moments slipped by unnoticed before? For some people, that press conference moment felt random, a one-off, just another awkward media exchange that would fade in a day or two. But for fans who have been watching closely, it didn't feel random at all. It felt familiar. Because this wasn't the first time a simple situation had been framed in a way that quietly put pressure on one person. And it wasn't the first time a neutral moment suddenly carried an edge it didn't need. Over time, patterns become visible not because of one headline but because of repetition. Similar tones, similar framing, similar questions that seem harmless on the surface, yet always drift toward the same conclusion. And fans began noticing that when it came to Shedeur, the margin for interpretation was always razor-thin. Good performance. The focus shifts to what could go wrong next. Solid preparation. Questions about whether it will translate. Quiet professionalism, interpreted as something being off. None of these moments alone mean much, but stacked together, they start telling a different story. What stood out most wasn't criticism. Criticism is part of sports. It was selective intensity. Other players made mistakes that passed quietly. Other situations were framed as learning experiences. But when it came to Shedeur, the lens always felt tighter, sharper, less forgiving. Fans online began pointing it out, not loudly at first, just comments here and there. Why does this always turn into a thing? Why is he always part of the angle? Why does this feel forced? And those questions didn't come from blind loyalty. They came from watching games, from hearing teammates speak, from seeing how coaches talked about preparation, leadership, and growth. The disconnect between reality and coverage was subtle but persistent. That's where speculation naturally starts creeping in. Not accusations, but curiosity. People wondering whether some narratives are simply easier to sell than others, whether certain names attract more attention, whether controversy is sometimes chosen, not discovered. To be clear, none of this proves intent, but it does explain why that press conference moment landed the way it did, why so many viewers instantly understood what was happening without needing it spelled out. Because once you've seen the pattern, you recognize the setup immediately. And what made this situation different wasn't just that it happened again. It was that this time, it didn't slide by quietly. This time, the script broke. And that break forced people to look backward and start re-examining moments that once felt isolated, but now seemed connected. What made the pattern stand out even more was what was happening on the field. Because when you strip away the commentary and the speculation, the actual performance told a much calmer story. Week after week, the tape didn't support the tension being built around him. The throws were there. The command was there. The preparation showed up in subtle ways: footwork, timing, decision-making under pressure. Nothing flashy, nothing reckless, just steady execution. And that's where the disconnect started to feel strange. If performance was slipping, criticism would make sense. If effort was lacking, questions would be fair. But that wasn't what teammates were seeing. Inside the building, the language was consistent. Coaches talked about work ethic. Players talked about trust. Teammates spoke openly about leadership, not the loud, performative kind, but the type that shows up in meetings and practices. That kind of feedback rarely gets attention. It doesn't drive debate. It doesn't spark arguments online, but it matters. So when coverage continued leaning toward uncertainty, fans started asking why. Why does the narrative feel heavier than the reality? Why does every small moment get magnified while consistency gets brushed aside? That's when perspective shifted, because it became clear this wasn't about fixing flaws. It was about filling space. And when there's no real issue to point to, the spotlight moves elsewhere: tone, body language, hypotheticals, what might happen instead of what actually is happening. This is where things get tricky in modern sports coverage. The game isn't just played on the field anymore. It's played in timelines, headlines, and comment sections. And sometimes, being solid isn't enough to slow that machine down. For Shedeur, that meant existing in a strange space, doing his job well while still being treated like a question mark, progress framed as wait and see, stability framed as something temporary. And yet through all of it, there was no visible panic, no public frustration, no emotional reactions feeding the cycle, just a steady focus on what he could control. That restraint mattered, because it made one thing clear: the noise wasn't coming from performance. And when performance doesn't explain the tension, comparisons usually aren't far behind. Because if you can't criticize what's happening, the easiest move is to suggest something else might be better. It didn't take long for the conversation to change direction. When direct criticism didn't land, the focus subtly moved somewhere else: comparisons. Not loud ones, not official ones, just enough to plant an idea and let it grow on its own. That's when another name started popping up more often: Dillon Gabriel. On paper, comparisons are normal. Quarterbacks get compared all the time. It's part of the sport. But this one felt premature. The timing was odd. The emphasis felt forced, and the way it was framed raised eyebrows. Instead of evaluating what was happening, the narrative drifted toward what could happen if someone else got more opportunity. Articles and discussions started hinting at questions no one inside the building was actually asking. Was there a competition? Was the team reconsidering? Was the situation less settled than it appeared? For fans watching closely, it felt like déjà vu. Because comparisons are an easy way to manufacture tension without making a direct claim. You don't have to say someone is failing. You just have to suggest someone else might be better. And suddenly, a storyline exists where none did before. What made this more noticeable was how quickly the tone shifted once reality stepped in. As time passed, the gap between speculation and performance became clearer. The hype cooled, the urgency faded, and quietly the narrative adjusted. Suddenly, the same voices that were pushing the comparison began praising Shedeur's poise, arm talent, and leadership. The language softened. The questions changed. To some, it looked like growth. To others, it looked like backpedaling. Because there was no acknowledgement of the earlier framing, no reflection on how aggressively the comparison had been pushed. Just a smooth transition, as if the previous doubts never existed. That kind of flip doesn't go unnoticed. Fans remembered the articles, the segments, the subtle suggestions that something wasn't quite right. And when the script changed without explanation, it only reinforced the feeling that the narrative had never been about evaluation. It was about momentum. But what really stood out was how temporary the praise felt. Because the moment another angle appeared, the spotlight drifted again. Not toward the field, not toward progress, but toward the next potential crack in the armor. That's the exhausting part of living inside constant comparison. Even when you outperform the expectation, the goalposts move. Even when the story shifts in your favor, it never feels settled. And just when it seemed like the noise might finally quiet down, something far smaller and far more ordinary suddenly became the headline. What happened next caught a lot of people off guard, not because it was serious, but because of how serious it was treated. A speeding ticket surfaced. That was it. No arrest, no suspension, no team discipline, just a routine traffic violation, the kind thousands of people get every single day without it becoming part of their public identity. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't even register as news. But this time, it didn't stay small. Suddenly, the language around it shifted. It wasn't framed as a mistake. It was framed as a signal. Questions started appearing about judgment, about maturity, about professionalism, as if one minor off-field moment somehow revealed a deeper issue that hadn't shown up anywhere else. That's when fans really started paying attention. Because context matters. And in this case, the context didn't justify the weight being placed on the story. No pattern of behavior, no history of issues, no internal concern from the organization, just a ticket elevated into something symbolic. It felt less like reporting and more like interpretation. And interpretation is powerful, because once you suggest that something ordinary might mean something more, you don't have to prove it. You just have to let the audience wonder. That's how doubt spreads quietly, without ever making a direct accusation. The reaction was immediate. Comment sections lit up. Some people questioned why this was even a discussion. Others noticed how quickly the tone turned from evaluation to judgment. And a few pointed out something uncomfortable: this level of scrutiny didn't seem to apply evenly. That's where frustration started to build. Because mistakes are part of being human, especially in high-pressure environments. Athletes aren't exempt from that. But when one person's minor slip becomes a measuring stick for character, while others barely register, it raises questions. What made this moment even more telling was how it was positioned. It wasn't just mentioned and moved on from. It was tied back into bigger narratives: leadership, readiness, trust, as if the entire conversation needed a negative counterweight. And yet, inside the building, nothing changed. No panic, no shift in role, no public concern from teammates or coaches. Life went on. That disconnect spoke volumes. Because when reality doesn't match the urgency of the coverage, people start wondering who the story is really for. Was it about accountability? Or was it about finding something, anything, to keep the tension alive? For a while, the response was silence. No public rebuttal, no defensive statements, just focus on the work. But moments like this have a way of stacking up. And eventually, silence stops feeling like professionalism and starts feeling like permission. For a long time, silence was the strategy, and honestly, it made sense. Responding to every headline only feeds the cycle. Engaging with every questionable angle turns a minor story into a lasting one. So instead, the focus stayed where it belonged: preparation, practice, progress. That approach is often praised. Let your play speak. Stay above the noise. It's the professional thing to do, and for a while it worked. But there's a downside to silence that rarely gets talked about. Because when narratives go unanswered for too long, they start to harden. Assumptions turn into expectations. Speculation starts sounding like fact. And eventually, people stop questioning the framing altogether. That's when silence stops being neutral. In this case, the moments kept stacking. The loaded questions, the shifting comparisons, the overblown reactions to minor issues. Each one on its own was easy to ignore. Together, they formed something heavier, a version of the story that didn't fully line up with reality, but was starting to stick anyway. And that's a dangerous place for any player to be. Because once a narrative settles in, everything gets filtered through it. Neutral actions get reinterpreted. Ordinary answers get dissected. Even doing nothing becomes something to analyze. That's why this moment mattered. The press conference wasn't explosive. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown across the room. But that's exactly why it landed so hard. It wasn't emotional, it was intentional. Instead of answering the question and letting the framing live on, he paused and addressed the process behind it. Not the outcome, not the headline, the setup. That's a line most players don't cross, because calling out the framing means acknowledging the game being played. And once you do that, you're no longer just responding, you're challenging the structure itself. That takes awareness, and more importantly, it takes timing. Because doing it too early looks defensive. Doing it too late looks reactive. But doing it in the moment, calmly, clearly, without escalation, changes the dynamic entirely. It sends a message without needing to raise your voice. The message was, "Leave me alone." It was, "I see what you're doing." And once that's said out loud, the rules shift. Because from that point on, silence isn't the default anymore. It becomes a choice, not a shield. And for the first time in a long while, the narrative wasn't moving without resistance. But what made this moment truly powerful wasn't just that he spoke up. It was how he did it. Because instead of reacting emotionally, he exposed the tactic, and in doing so, took control back in real time. What stood out most in that moment wasn't defiance, it was precision. There was no rant, no frustration spilling over, no attempt to score points or embarrass anyone in the room. Instead, the response was measured, almost surgical. He didn't attack the person asking the question. He addressed the mechanism behind it. That distinction mattered. By calling out the framing instead of the individual, he shifted the conversation from emotion to intent. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on how he felt about a coaching change or what quote could be pulled from the exchange. It was on why the question existed in the first place. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed again. Because everyone in that room understood exactly what was being said, even if it wasn't spelled out. This wasn't about refusing to answer. It was about refusing to participate in a setup designed to create noise where there didn't need to be any. That's a power move most players don't make, not because they can't, but because they're trained not to. Media training teaches you how to deflect, how to soften, how to survive the moment. What it doesn't teach you is how to challenge the premise itself. And that's what made this different. In real time, the balance shifted. The cameras kept rolling, but the script was gone. The usual rhythm of question-answer headline broke, and for a brief moment, the pressure reversed. Instead of being analyzed, he was the one doing the analysis. That kind of composure sends a message far beyond one exchange. It tells everyone watching that he understands how narratives are built, and that he's not going to hand over control just to keep things comfortable. It also sets a boundary. Not a loud one, not an aggressive one, but a clear one. From that point on, every question carries a little more weight. Every angle has to be cleaner. Because once someone shows they can recognize a tactic mid-play, it becomes much harder to use it again without being exposed. And that's why the reaction online was so immediate. Fans didn't see someone being difficult. They saw someone being aware, someone protecting their name without turning it into a spectacle. That awareness doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from experience, from watching how small moments get reframed, from seeing how quickly narratives can spin away from reality if no one interrupts them. And by choosing that moment, not earlier, not later, he made something very clear. He wasn't trying to win the day's headline. He was resetting the rules for everything that comes next. And once that happens, the conversation stops being about one press conference and starts being about who really controls the story moving forward. By the time the cameras shut off, it was clear this was never just about a single exchange. It wasn't about one question, one reporter, or one awkward moment in a press room. It was about something much larger: control. In today's sports world, performance alone doesn't shape perception. Narratives do. Headlines do. The way a moment is framed can matter just as much as what actually happened. And for a long time, those narratives moved freely, often without resistance. That's what made this moment different. Instead of letting another small moment snowball into something it wasn't, Shedeur stopped the cycle before it could start. Not by arguing facts, not by defending himself emotionally, but by calling attention to the process itself, the subtle push toward controversy that so often goes unnoticed. And once that process is exposed, it loses power. Because fans aren't blind. They can tell the difference between accountability and agenda, between tough questions and manufactured tension. And when someone finally says what many were already thinking, it changes how future moments are viewed. This wasn't a declaration of war on the media. It wasn't a demand for special treatment. It was something far more controlled, a reminder that participation is optional, that not every question deserves an answer if the premise is flawed. That's an important shift, because silence can protect you for a while, but awareness protects you longer. From here on out, every interaction carries a new layer. Questions will be examined more carefully, framing will be noticed faster, and narratives won't move as effortlessly as they once did. Not because someone is being confrontational, but because the game has been acknowledged out loud. And maybe that's the real takeaway. In an era where stories are often shaped before answers are given, the strongest move isn't always what you say next. Sometimes it's recognizing the setup and refusing to step into it.